The Pennsylvania Gazette, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, May 24th, 1796. Advertisement. Absconded from the household of the President of the United States, Oney Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes and bushy hair. She is of middle stature, slender, and delicately formed, about 20 years of age. She has many changes of good clothes of all sorts, but they are not sufficiently recollected to be described. As there was no suspicion of her going off, nor no provocation to do so, it's not easy to conjecture whether she has gone or fully what her design is. But as she may attempt to escape by water, all matters of vessels are cautioned against admitting her into them, although it is probable she will attempt to pass as a free woman and has, it is said, wherewithal to pay her passage. $10 will be paid to any person who will bring her home, if taken in the city or on board any vessel in the harbor, and a reasonable additional sum if apprehended at and brought from a greater distance, and in proportion to the distance. Frederick Kitt, Stewart.
I'm going to tell you a story today, and it's longer than most stories that I would tell from the pulpit. So I'm going to ask you to decide ahead of time that you're going to pay attention to me until I'm done talking today. And you YouTube viewers, let me just caution you that we can tell when you stop watching. So hang with me. Religions and nations alike have myths of origins. And as children, we all learn the story of how our first president, when he was a child, used his little hatchet and chopped down a cherry tree on the family plantation. And when confronted by his father, Washington is said to have confessed, "I cannot tell a lie. It was me." Today I'm going to tell you a sad story about how, as it turns out, the historical George Washington could tell a lie. And it isn't simply that he lied about the young slave in his household, Oney Judge, but I want to talk about the way ethical thinking tends to evolve, sometimes around a lot of lies. If you have a kind of gone with the wind view of American history, you can believe that the institution of slavery in our country was just a normal form of what Stephen Colbert likes to call an uncompensated intern program. And that was the labor arrangement in our country before the Civil War. Like before the Civil War, decent people, especially in the South, owned slaves. After the Civil War, no one owned slaves. But the truth is infinitely more complex than that. Ending slavery in our country was more like a century-long debate that culminated in a bloody, horrible Civil War. But sadly, even when the war and the Emancipation Proclamation were over, that did not snuff out slavery. It did start to open some doors to greater freedom, but an institution like slavery works its way into the fabric of society, and it doesn't end all at once. Evaluations of voting patterns in the United States in 2016 indicate a huge difference in the former slave states and the non-slave states. It's still a part of our unconscious decision-making. At the end of the Civil War, we invented sharecropping and things like the Pullman porters in the growing frequency of train travel. Porters were typically freed slaves who were not paid a salary. They were given the opportunity to earn tips, and that is how tipping started as a tradition in the United States that holds over into restaurants today. And even now, restaurant workers are allowed to be paid a tiny fraction of even our poor minimum wage out of the assumption that they're essentially working for tips. We should also be aware that in the institution of slavery, slaveholders provided housing, food, clothing to their slaves, which is not typically possible for someone who's earning minimum wage. So I would argue that as long as the minimum wage is less than a living wage, that slavery is not over in America. But more graphically, we should never forget that the majority of the clothing, the shoes, the household goods, the toys, and even the food found on the shelves at Walmart were produced by slaves, mostly in Asia and in Central America. And some were produced by prisoners in our jails and our prisons. Or did you think that we have 2.5 million people in prison because they are all that much more evil than you are? Or didn't you know that for very many years, and maybe it's not ever cricket for a gentleman to tell a lady's secret, but Victoria's secret, her real secret, was that all of that sexy underwear was being made by men in prison who were being paid pennies a day. And see, you thought the ads were obscene. It's nothing compared to the circumstances in which they're being made. But I digress. Let's get back to George Washington. George Washington, I'm sorry, Bill, you want to see the other picture? Stop it. George Washington became very wealthy the old-fashioned way. He married a widow who had an estate that was worth about $10 million in today's economy. Martha's estate included several slaves. Now, when George Washington was elected the first president, he and Martha had to move from their Virginia plantation to the president's residence, which was at that time in New York City. The next year, the capital was moved from New York to Philadelphia, and it remained there until Washington, D.C. had been built and the White House and the Capitol building, and John Adams, the second president, was the first one to actually live in Washington. Now, when Washington became president, Martha's personal assistant, Oney Judge, was 17 years old. In Virginia, Oney slept in a room just outside of Martha's bedroom. She was Martha's personal servant, and she spent her days combing Martha's hair, mending her clothes, helping to select her outfits, and basically was the body person for Martha Washington. But Pennsylvania was not like Virginia. Philadelphia, in particular, had more freed slaves than any other city in America. Oney moved there and saw for the first time in her life black men and women walking up and down the streets, selling their wares and being completely free as if that were normal. That was not normal in Virginia. But she saw for the first time that it was possible for someone like her to come to the end of her bondage. But slavery, as I've told you, it didn't end in a straight line. Pennsylvania had passed a law that allowed slaveholders to move there with their slaves. But after 6 months of living there, the slaves were automatically emancipated. So she saw what liberty looked like, and she saw there was a path. But Washington was unwilling to give up the lifestyle that came with having uncompensated personal attendance. He wrote to his secretary that when any one of his 6 or 7 household slaves had been in Philadelphia for more than 5 months, they were to be rotated with other slaves from the plantation in Virginia. And there were more than 100 living there in Virginia. And then he could bring them back. After just a few days in Virginia, he could bring them back to Pennsylvania, and the 6-month clock started all over again. And he instructed his secretary to do this in a way that deceived both the slave and the public. What he was doing was legal, but it was morally reprehensible to most of the people around him. He was living in a state where people did not agree with owning slaves, but he was going to continue to do it in a way that made him look innocent. Washington had also had a law passed that allowed a slaveholder to use a slave hunter to capture under any circumstances and in any place a runaway slave. This was the first Fugitive Slave Act that Washington had passed for his own personal use. A captured runaway could be flogged when they were retrieved. They could be punished in any number of ways, but the most common practice was to sell them to a sugarcane plantation in the Caribbean, where they would be worked to death in a matter of months. Now, in spite of these threats, when Oney learned that she was probably going to be given as a wedding gift to one of Martha's granddaughters who lived in the South, which was a place that Oney never wanted to live in again, she decided to escape. So one May evening, when the Washingtons were entertaining house guests, she slipped away, made it down to the river, and boarded a ship called the Nancy, where she went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Washingtons wanted her back, but they didn't want to be humiliated, both by the fact that a member of their domestic household had become a fugitive, nor did they want to admit publicly that they had been outsmarted by a 20-year-old black girl that they had never taught how to read and write. So they did what Americans of the era often did. They blamed a Frenchman. You'll believe anything about a Frenchman. Washington concocted a lie that Oney had been seduced to run away by some lecherous, amorous Frenchman. It was harder for Oney to hide in Portsmouth because there were fewer blacks there, and predictably, she was eventually spotted by a friend of the Washington family, who then let them know where Oney was living. Now, Washington felt that it was his purview as President of the United States to enlist federal employees to do his personal bidding. The president had lost property, and so he was willing to use military forces, government employees to get his property back. So you see, Donald Trump wasn't the first American president who thought that there was a financial benefit to be gained from holding the office. It happens there was a customs collector in the small town of Portsmouth, Joseph Whipple, and Washington instructed him to find, capture, and return Oney to Philadelphia. And here's another issue in the evolution of morality. Whipple and his wife had recently freed their slaves. They no longer believed that participating in slave owning was morally acceptable. But he was being ordered by the President of the United States to capture and return a slave, even though he personally found slavery not to be morally acceptable. Now, this is a trap we oftentimes find ourselves in. We have a principle. None of us would want to own slaves. And yet we are all aware that virtually all the products for sale in Walmart were produced by slaves. So if you don't want to support slavery, you don't want to shop at Walmart, right? But the prices are so much cheaper. Can you feel me? I mean, this is where ethics starts to happen. We're against slavery, but we're in favor of low prices. So Whipple tried to split the difference. He tricked Oney to coming to his office on the promise of giving her a job. And once there, he started asking her about her French boyfriend, which she obviously patently denied, and insisted that what had seduced her was the desire to be free. So he tried to reason with her and said, you know, the Washingtons love you, they miss you, and if you would be willing to go back, maybe they would agree to emancipate you eventually, maybe 8, 9, 10 years more labor, and they would set you free. And to get out of his office, she agreed to whatever he said. She said she would go along with it. So Whipple sends a letter to Washington explaining the situation, and Washington writes back that he will absolutely not emancipate her, that he would never reward a person for committing a federal crime. He tried to make it sound like it was a moral issue. You don't reward a slave for running away. Oney was property, and she was not going to receive favorable treatment. Whipple caved in to authority, to power, and he went to Oney's home to take her by force. But of course, she was no idiot. She was gone. She moved to a small community a few miles away where Oney met and married a sailor named Jack. And with him, she gave birth to a daughter, Eliza. Can you imagine being free, marrying the man you love, and having a child and getting to raise them? But she was also aware that the child of a slave was technically property of the slave owner. And so being a fugitive became all the more important because Washington was still not giving up on trying to find her and bring her back. Eventually, he sent his nephew, Burwell Bassett, who found her, and he kindly tried to persuade her to come back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. She again flatly refused. Burwell knew that she was going to fight, and so he decided he needed to go get a rope and some strong men to bind her and take her aboard a boat and take her back. But of course, by the time he got those men and a rope, she was hiding again. Even though the Washingtons were never able to recover Oney, the story is not an especially happy one. Oney had 3 children with Jack, but unfortunately Jack died very young, and Oney found it impossible to support her family. So she had to do the only thing she could do to keep her children from starving. She contracted her daughters out as indentured servants on farms nearby, and her son followed in his father's footsteps and became a sailor, and Oney never saw him again. Now, eventually, George Washington died, and it was made very public that he stipulated in his will that his slaves were to be emancipated when Martha died, which for a very clever man was not a very clever thing to say. There were 120 people living in these dormitories, head to foot on Mount Vernon, and the only thing that kept them enslaved was an old white woman. Turns out there were some mysterious fires in Mount Vernon at the time, some other incidents, and Martha became aware that she was going to be killed if she did not emancipate the slaves. So she corrected George's will and went ahead and emancipated all of the slaves on the plantation, excluding Oney Judge. Her daughters eventually worked off their indentured servanthood, and they and their mother tried to survive together in the crushing poverty that was the lot of even the freed black people of those days. Eventually, Oney sold the only thing that she had ever owned, which was her story of slavery and a life as a fugitive from the first president of the United States. She sold her story to an anti-slavery magazine just before she died when she was about 70 years old. Now, folks, it's my job as a minister to write eulogies for the deceased. And I try my best not to ever be guilty of dancing on the graves of the fallen. But honestly, I cannot tell a lie. So even when I'm delivering a eulogy, I don't lie about the deceased. So if you see me at a funeral waxing eloquent about morality, quoting Feuerbach and Kierkegaard, it is safe for you to assume that I am avoiding talking about the deceased. I can be diplomatic. It doesn't come naturally to me, but I can be diplomatic. But you know, Confucius said, no one ever plasters a dung wall. So I don't try to put a lot of flowers on the graves of a horrible person. And I expect nothing less from you when I die. If you're around to speak at my memorial, I want you to tell the truth and nothing less. So let me ask you, was George Washington a great man? He did a lot of good things. He risked his life in service of the country. He was, in many ways, the father of our nation. And I'm not just talking about all the different people he had affairs with. I mean in other ways. Is it too soon? What? He wrote wonderful documents about freedom and liberty. He delivered speeches, most notably his farewell speech when he finished his second term as president, when he left office. But even while he was trying his best to find and return Oney to slavery, that he could talk out of both sides of his mouth. Now, no one is perfect. Good people, without exception, do bad things. But Washington was very well informed regarding all of the debates around slavery. You cannot say that it was legal and acceptable at that time. He knew the contra-arguments. There were people all around him who had thought their way through this issue, and they had freed their slaves at considerable personal financial sacrifice. Washington just wasn't willing to do that. Now, I've made the same observation about the Prophet Muhammad through the years, who, in his 50s, married a 6-year-old girl. And many of his defenders would speak up and say, yes, but he didn't consummate the marriage until she was 9. Does that make it better? There were people in Muhammad's life, in his inner circle, his friends, who begged him not to do it. But it was legal. Even though people knew that it was wrong, Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 years old. So with apologies to defenders of the Prophet Muhammad, was Muhammad a pedophile? How could you get around that? Ethics is always a moving target, and the best people among us make compromises. Now, I felt it was important for me to tell this rather long story about Oney today because I'm suspecting that most of you had never heard it before. But I didn't tell it so that we could sit here more than 200 years later to pass judgment on George Washington. But I wanted to remind you to examine your own life, because your kids are going to examine your life when you're gone. Later generations will examine our lives with the kind of objectivity that we're bringing to George Washington and the Prophet Muhammad. For me, at least a part of my ongoing relationship with a spiritual community is the simple fact that being in community helps me to consider my own life in ways that will hopefully help me to be a better person, to make fewer compromises. Now, I wish that when George Whipple got that second letter from George Washington telling him to take Oney by force, I wish he had been the kind of man that could write to the president and tell him, hell no. I wish that Burwell Bassett had never gone to get a rope and some strong men to help capture Oney. But more than that, when the time for moral decision-making in the face of either fortune or in the face of overwhelming power and authority comes to me, that I will make a choice that will make you proud when you stand up to speak at my memorial. When Ted Kennedy said of his brother Bobby at his memorial, he famously said, "My brother need not be idolized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. He should be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, who saw suffering and tried to heal it, who saw war and tried to stop it." Beautiful words. But I am forced to wonder that if Marilyn Monroe had lived long enough to be at that memorial, would she have agreed with what Ted said? We live our lives one moment at a time, making decisions, always without the perspective of history. But we are left to try to live in a way that when the lights are turned on, we can hope that the sum total is that we have been good and decent people who saw wrong and tried to right it, who saw suffering and tried to heal it, who tried to leave a legacy of ethical decision-making that will outweigh our mistakes. Have courage. Avoid compromise. Advocate for freedom. Don't buy the rope, not even for the President of the United States.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.